Well, last week we began missing because you were afraid of the cold, which I totally understand. Isn't it nice to be at today's temperature? That was bad. Even from Minnesota, I would admit that was bad. And so it's great to be in this wonderful warming trend here this weekend. But we began a series on the life of Abraham. And Abraham is a critical part of Old Testament history in that Abraham is ultimately the father of Israel. And God was using Israel to be a light to the nations in the Old Testament. So we're not going to revisit what we talked about yesterday. You can visit that online if you'd like to. But today I want to talk about one of Abraham's early first challenges as we discuss the journey, how God creates faith in us, and that challenge was the world around him. And our challenge is the world around us. Ted DeHaas writes, on April 2nd, 2001, one of the worst fishing accidents in North America in 50 years took place on the Bering Sea. The Arctic Rose, a 92-foot commercial fishing trawler, went down in the frigid water 200 miles northwest of St. Paul Island. All 15 crewmen went down with the ship. No radio call for help was sent. The Coast Guard began an investigation that lasted for 3 years. The Arctic Rose was discovered beneath over 400 feet of icy water. Only one body, the captain, was found. The inquiry drew conclusions based on underwater video of the wreck. Although the exact cause is not known, a possible reason for the disaster did surface. The underwater cameras showed that several of the ship's doors and hatches were left open. And since not all the members of the crew were experienced seamen, the theory was that these novices didn't understand the importance of keeping a ship's watertight doors closed. Investigators said this ill-trained, inexperienced crew frequently actually tied the doors open to let fresh air into the boat's fish processing area. They didn't want to smell those fish guts, so they opened the doors. And then when waves from the rough sea would have swept into the trawler through those open doors, they went into other doors and hatches, and as a result, that boat could have gone down in less than 2 minutes. Not all open doors in our lives are positive opportunities. Some are an invitation to disaster. Now, sometimes as Christ followers, we're a little bit like those sailors. We're in the Jesus boat, when we're working hard, we're down in the fish cleaning area, but we don't recognize sometimes the threats along the way that can sort of sink our faith lives. Or we see the threats, but we just assume we're going to be fine. We're going to be fine. And we leave some dangerous threats open. Now, one of those threats is the world around us. The Bible talks about many threats to the soul. It talks about the world, which is what we're talking about today. It talks about the flesh. Now, some people define the flesh as the old nature, a proclivity to sin. Some people would say the flesh is simply our physical body trained by the old nature. So there's some debate about that. But the Bible talks about the world being a threat, the flesh being a threat, and Satan being a threat. So we have things that threaten our spiritual lives, but we're talking about the world. Now, I don't mean the physical world. We're not talking about the earth, if you will. I'm talking about the Greek word cosmos, which Jesus used, which Paul used, other apostles used. It's what Jesus was talking about when he said, love not the world. He's not talking about the earth itself. He's talking about this cosmos. We'll explain in a moment. Paul says, don't be conformed to the world. Don't be pressed into the world's mold, you could translate that. And so when we see this word pop up, and you need context to determine meaning on this a little bit, here's what a definition of the world is. Now, this is my definition. This isn't some Greek scholar's definition. But here's my definition based on the New Testament of what it is. The world, if we could get that up there. Is it up? The world is the philosophical, intellectual, cultural system of beliefs and traditions hostile to God and his kingdom or influence in this world. All right? Put a lot of words in there. But it's basically what we run up against that's hostile to faith, hostile to the kingdom of God in this world. When you look at it that way, the world is our competition. The world sets the standards for humanity that we as Christ followers tend to disagree with. The world killed Jesus. And here's the problem for you and me. It's a problem for all of us. The world is attractive. The world is tempting. There are lots of things in the world that we kind of like. The world is the dispenser of really, really, really good times, and many of them are sinful but fun. The world wants you to fit in, and the reality is, I want to fit in, and you want to fit in. We don't want to be oddballs because we're following Jesus. We really want everyone to like us. So we kind of want Jesus, and we want to fit in here too, and sometimes we can have both, and sometimes we can't. If we fit into this world perfectly, we've probably become spiritually impotent. Now, I'm not saying we need to stand out from the crowd unnecessarily and, dress differently and be so different that everyone just recognizes us from our appearance like, oh, those are worse. I'm not saying that, but our values should stand out. Our values should make us a little bit different in this world. That's not easy for us. Because did you know that people like us, all of us, are naturally sort of crowd followers? We try to fit in. Martin Lindstrom, a former market research expert, author of Brand Washed, argues that advertisers know something about you and I that we have in common with birds and termites. This will be new for you. Without even thinking about it, we're often controlled by peer pressure. For instance, Lindstrom notes how many bird species rise from a field in complete synchrony as though they're doing a choreographed dance. I have never seen a flock of birds take off and they run into each other and hit the ground. Have you? I haven't. There's a lot of birds I'd like to see that happen with, like seagulls, Seattle Seahawk, never mind. All right. But anyway, hey, wasn't that a great game last week? And I know you're not that big of NFL fans that you resent that like in America, right? Okay. All right. You can pray for my team today. We're in big trouble. But birds rise like they're choreographed. And scientists will say that the birds are acting as if they shared one collective brain. Termites also act like one enormous termite brain. In other words, only by observing and mimicking the behavior of its neighbors can a termite figure out what it should be doing. Birds and termites, they sort of go as a group. They act as a group, like they're all connected. Lindstrom observes that as consumers, human beings act the same way, and they've done studies on this. Just like those birds and termites, we are wired with a collective consciousness in that we size up what those around us are doing and we modify our actions and behaviors accordingly. In 2008, they did an experiment conducted by researchers at Leeds University. Groups of people were instructed to walk around a large hall aimlessly. So they basically sent a bunch of people in there and said, just walk around. You don't have to go anywhere. They weren't to converse with one another, they were just to walk around. But first, the researchers gave just a few of the people detailed instructions on where precisely they should walk. And when the researchers observed the resulting behavior, they found that no matter how large or small the group, everyone in it blindly followed the handful of people who appeared to have some idea of where they were supposed to be going. As one of the researchers put it, the research suggests that humans flock like sheep and birds, subconsciously following a minority of individuals, and it takes a mere 5% of informed individuals to influence the direction of a crowd of up to 200 people. The other 95% trail along without even being aware of it. They're not even consciously thinking that they're following others. There's ample research to show that we instinctively look to the behaviors of others to inform the decisions we make, everything from which we should, the way we should walk, to what music we should listen to which kind of car we should drive. It seems, in short, that we instinctively believe that others know more about what we want than we ourselves do. Psychologists have a name for this. It's called peer pressure. And we're all subject to it because we all want to fit in. We naturally acclimate to the culture around us. We naturally do it. We have to think about not doing it. And peer pressure is not new. Peer pressure goes back to the beginning of time, and we're going to read about it in Genesis. So I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 13. It's on page 8 in your Bibles, page 8. Genesis chapter 13. Probably, if you grew up in the church, it's probably a familiar story. If you didn't, it won't be. And we'll be adding to it a little bit in chapter 14, but we won't read that. I'll just tell you the story later. Chapter 13, page 8, Genesis 13. So Abram, we're going to call him Abraham. He's eventually renamed Abraham. So Abraham went up from Egypt. Remember, he had gone down there during a famine. He went to the Negev, sort of the lower hill country, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now, Lot's a relative. Now, Abraham was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold. Now, just to give you an idea, he already has over 300 trained men, we find from chapter 14, that he sends into battle in a regional skirmish, 318 to be exact. Those are men who can fight. That's probably separating some really old guys and the women and children. So it's probably true that Abraham already, even though he doesn't have a child, probably is managing 2,000 to 3,000 people in his clan. Don't think of Abraham as a family. Think of Abraham as a really wealthy guy who's sort of managing 2,000 to 3,000 people who are following him into the promised land. He went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly, and there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. And the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's flock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land as well. He's saying that to show the competition for resources. So Abraham said to Lot, "Please, let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if to the right, then I'll go to the left." Now Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley, and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, "Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you, and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you." Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Just 3 simple points. First, the world has always been a spiritual danger on the journey of faith. Now, when you get into narrative literature, and Genesis is historical narrative, so I'm talking about a genre of scripture. When you're trying to interpret the Bible, there are sort of rules for interpretation. You've got certain rules for interpreting the Psalms, rules for interpreting sort of the epistles, which are more direct, and we understand the point much more clearly. When you get to narrative literature like this, it's not as clear sometimes what Moses, who wrote this, is intending to get across. So you look for editorial comments made by the editor of Scripture, in this case Moses. You have a few editorial comments in this. Genesis 12:7b or 13:7b. Now the Canaanite and Perizzite were dwelling then in the land. That's probably there to show that there's competition for resources, but we also know that there was some pretty bad worship practices that came with that group, sort of temple prostitution and things like that. Not a good place to be. Genesis 13:10b, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So we know that there's this lurking evil right next to Abraham and Lot. And then verse 13, the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. The Hebrew there, the construction there is basically saying these guys are worse than average. This is a rough crowd that Abraham and Lot are next to. The world has always been sort of a scary place for people who want to have conservative ethics and morals and pass them on to their children. It just has been. Now, I'm not that old, but I'm not that young. 39 is not old or young. But the reality is, I've been around long enough to have seen some changes in the world around us, and it hasn't been good. Hasn't been good. There's been some progress in certain areas where there needed to be progress. But when it comes to the broader cultures in the Western world, they're all headed sort of away from any sense that something is right and wrong, something is true, other things are false. We all know that in this postmodern world, it's tough. compared to maybe the 70s and 80s and some of those eras, we see the culture shifting, we see the world shifting, and we tend to think things have never been this bad, right? If you're older than me, if you're in your 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s, it's not lying if nobody believes you, by the way, on age. Anyway, it's kind of like Christmas presents. You can lie, Jesus forgives that one. But anyway, if you've been around a long time, you tend to think things have never been this bad. I got to tell you something, things have always been bad. There have been a few aberrations in history, maybe after the Reformation in Europe and maybe in modernity in some of North America and other places. And there are some countries in Africa now with predominantly Christian populations. There are some places in the world where you see things sort of headed in a very conservative direction morally, because there are countries where majority of the populations are Christians, but in the Western world, it's the opposite. It's waning. The reality is, for most of history, believers have been living in a philosophically hostile environment. We've always been the minority movement, except in a few possible exceptions. We've generally been sort of the guerrilla warfare underneath the broader culture, trying to bring Jesus and light into it. Rarely are Christians the dominant influencers in a culture. The world around us is always a somewhat appealing dominant culture, though. And so it's always been dangerous to faith, because the world around us expects us to fit in and assimilate. And if we do, faith dies. Now, like I said, in narrative literature, the editor will make these editorial comments so that we get the key points. And we saw the editor making several of these comments in chapter 13, that the area around them, but particularly the area that Lot was going to be headed to, was not a good place to be ethically and morally. Pagan worship in that area was rampant. Blatant immorality was the norm. And apart from a vibrant faith, 4000 BC, that was going to be appealing. When you can mix sex and religion, it was going to be appealing. And that's exactly what those cultures did. They mixed sex and religion. But the world has always been a spiritual danger if you're going to be a person of faith. Second, Abraham gave Lot a choice of options as to where he would dwell, which was actually, in my opinion, and I'm going to try to support it here, a moral choice by Abraham. The choice to give Lot a choice was actually Abraham's choice. Abraham had recently returned from Egypt. He came to the area where he had built an altar to God, and God had appeared to him there. So it was natural when he came back, he's thinking, where do I want to go? I want to go to this place where God has literally appeared to me, not just spoken to me, but he saw some visible manifestation of God. So that was a big deal. That just doesn't happen every day. And so he goes back to that spot. Abraham and Lot are not regular nomads. They are the 1%ers. They were wealthy dudes in that era. All kinds of people that they managed and took care of. They were responsible for huge flocks and herds. They're both extremely wealthy. Abraham, I think, is managing 2,000 to 3,000 people, plus flocks and animals. And in this very semi-arid climate, pasture is hard to find. Still is in that part of the world. And as Moses comments, the Canaanite and the Perizzite were there. And I think when he first says that, he's not even thinking about the pagan religious systems that they could be drawn into. I think he's just saying that Abraham and Lot are not just on the promised land by themselves, they're competing with these ancient cultures for resources. They're not alone. And so the employees of Abraham and Lot are struggling. They're coming back to the common wells. They're coming back to the common places for feeding and grazing. They're coming back to the common campsites. And they're more loyal to their leader, if you will, than they are to getting along as a team. So the people who are committed to Lot are not getting along with the people committed to Abraham. And Abraham recognizes, we just got a problem here. It's just sort of a structural problem we got to deal with. It's a big country. And so he gave Lot the choice of destinations where he was going to take his people and herds and flocks. But here's my point. I think giving Lot a choice was Abraham making a choice that he wasn't headed towards Sodom and Gomorrah. See, Abraham didn't have to give Lot this choice. Who's the patriarch here? Abraham. Abraham is the one who received the promises from God. God had appeared to Abraham. It's Abraham's choice to make. Abraham's just sort of being the bigger person here, but there is no reason he has to do this. So why did he let Lot choose? In my opinion, and I'm going to try to prove it in a minute, Abraham had no intention of living in Sodom and Gomorrah under any circumstances. Can I absolutely prove it? Well, I'm going to try to in a second. I think I have a pretty good story that will prove it. I believe Abraham absolutely recognized the moral danger in the valley. And he was also beginning to trust God more for his future. How do I know that? I know that because of the next chapter, which we never talk about. So I'm going to tell you a story. I'm not going to read it. But chapter 14 displays this beautifully. And at the end of it, the editor, Moses, makes a comment about Abraham's faith. So we're going to jump ahead. Lot goes and lives by the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah down in the plain. There's 5 cities of the plain. They're all very wealthy because they live in this lush valley. The region is dominated by a group of kings from the east. So you've got Sodom and Gomorrah, 3 other cities, and they pay tribute to a group of kings who live much further east along maybe the Tigris and Euphrates, sort of ancient Babylon area. And these kings of the east were content to leave the cities of the plain or the cities of the valley alone as long as they paid them tribute. That was normal in the ancient world. You have a dominant world power. They don't need to invade every area and station soldiers there. They just tell the people there, you pay us once a year, X amount, X percentage of what you have, and we'll leave you alone. And if wars come, we'll protect you. That was a normal arrangement. And for 12 years, that deal had worked. In year 13, the kings of the valley, these are like city-states. They have kings of cities. So in year 13, the kings in the valley here are tired of paying. They're thinking, you know what? The kings of the east are a long ways away. We can probably defend ourselves. We're not worried about it. We're not giving them our money. So there's sort of a little bit of a tax revolt, all right? That got your attention. There was a tax revolt. And they said, we're not paying any tribute. Well, year 14, Chedorlaomer, one of these kings, led the other 3 from the east against the cities of the valley. If you're not going to pay us, we're taking over. They came with their armies. They came across those cities where Lot was living, Sodom and Gomorrah and the other 3, and they ransacked them. They sacked them. They plundered them. They took everything that was left. Lot and his family were in those cities. Some people were fortunate enough to hear the people coming. They fled to the hills. Many were captured. Everything was taken. Chapter 14, verse 11 says, all the goods were taken. All their food supply was taken. One person escaped and went up to Abraham, who was probably up on the central plateau of Israel. And there was a few leaders that Abraham was allied with to make sure they could protect themselves. Together, these clans, Abraham and these other clans that he's allied with, pursued the 4 kings and their army. They chased them far to the north, into what became Damascus or Syria. They went far north. They recovered everything. He brought back Lot, his relative, and his family, all of it. And on their return, Abraham tithes to a local priest called Melchizedek. That's an introduction of an interesting character. And then the king of Sodom makes this offer to Abraham. He says, I want you to take everything you've brought back. We are so thankful, Abraham, that you managed this counter warfare sort of effort and you brought back all of our people. You know, God bless you. We want the people. Thank you for that rescue. You take everything they owned. All the plunder, it's yours. We would have never gotten it back. This is the king of Sodom saying this for the other kings. You know what Abraham's response was? Look at this. Chapter 14, verses 22 and 23. Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours for fear that you would say, I have made Abraham rich. Isn't that an interesting response from Abraham? I find that shocking. Now, he said, all the other guys who are with me, all my other allies, they can take their share, but Abraham would not take a thing. He had no interest in being enriched by this immoral king, by this immoral culture. Because Abraham at this point was now trusting God. And that's why I believe when he and Lot stood on the central plateau and they're deciding their future, where are you going to go? I'll go the other direction. Sodom was never in Abraham's mind. He knew the moral dangers down in the valley. He knew God wouldn't be pleased, and God was pleased with his choice. He wouldn't have been pleased if Abraham had headed to Sodom and Gomorrah. And we see later that Lot and his family became just like those towns. Third, God promised to give to Abraham more than the world could offer. So we're going to back up in time for just a second to the moment that Lot chose the valley and Abraham got the semi-arid pasture land. We're going back in time now, before this battle took place, before the tax revolt and everything. God had a few words for Abraham. You gave up the world. Now I'm going to give you everything. Your descendants are going to own every inch of this land, including the fertile valley. So right after Lot chooses the best pasture land, all the green grass of the valley, God says to Abraham, lift up your eyes, look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward. For all the land which you see, I'm going to give it to you and to your descendants forever. He says, walk all over it. It's all going to be yours. Do you know what's interesting about that? That included Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain. God was saying, Lot chose that? That's fine. Someday, you and this nation I'm going to raise up through you are going to get everything. Abraham gave up the world, and God said, I'm going to give it all to you, including what you gave up. Part of our journey, part of our faith journey is the belief that following God first, giving up what the world may offer, doesn't mean you can't prosper in this world, but giving up the world's values, the way the world thinks, trusting in God's best for us, that's the best life possible. If you're going to be a Christ follower, you got to believe that putting Jesus first is your best life possible, even if it costs you some things while you're here. It's going to be the narrow road. It's the road without compromise, where you have to come to the point where you believe at some level that God is the prize, not the world. God's the prize, and that's going to be enough. Doesn't mean you're not going to prosper. You may prosper greatly. I'm not going to, Abraham's one of the 1% here. I mean, he's a wealthy guy, but he still gave up the world, and he let God enrich him. He chose not to compromise to get there. To be on a faith journey with God, we've kind of got to decide that where the world's going to be in our priorities. And we're not going to compromise. I want to just close with 3 simple applications. First, understand why God is concerned about the world. So why does God have such a concern about this? In his book, Chuck Bentley writes, this goes back to the very nature of God. There's a name for God that we seldom ever use. I know I don't use it very often, he said. That name is jealous. It's actually one of the names for God. Sounds strange, doesn't it? When we call somebody jealous here, it's usually to point out a character flaw. Like you want what somebody else has. Or, if you're dating somebody, like, they can't have friends because you're jealous and possessive and insecure. That's the way we use the word. How can something we consider bad be attributed to God, especially one of his names? Doesn't the fact that God is a jealous God seem a little odd and negative? Exodus 34:14 says, do not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous. Name equals character in the Bible. Whose character is jealous, is a jealous God. Back in the late 1960s, there was a popular TV Western series called The Guns of Will Sonnet. Walter Brennan played the title role, a scripture-quoting man with a reputation for unparalleled gunfighting skills. As the series progressed, viewers say the wise old man avoided more gunfights than he got into. Viewers saw the wise old man avoid more gunfights than he got into. And the statements about his abilities were as follows. No brag, just fact. God has the title of jealous because he's the only one worthy of all our affection and adoration. No brag, just fact. He's God. We're not. We're his creation. The complete worthiness of ultimate praise grants him and him alone the right to be the jealous one. He's God Almighty. He's at the top of all kings, all lords, all gods, all things. So jealousy is normative if you're God. Now, it still may bother you a little bit, so let me give you a human illustration a little bit. God doesn't want to share you. God made you. You're made in his image, and you'll only be right in yourself when you find God and you worship him. It's what you were intended to do. It's not his weakness speaking, it's his holiness speaking. God doesn't want to share you in the same way that you don't want to share your spouse. In the same way you're jealous about your marriage. It's right to be jealous in your marriage, to say, when you made those vows, you are committed to each other. There'll be fidelity there and faithfulness. You are loyal to each other. In that same way, God is jealous, and he wants your loyalty and your commitment. That's what's going on. That's why God's concerned about the world around us, because it is going to tug and tug and tug against those values that would make you loyal and committed to the one who created you, who wants to be in relationship with you. He's not going to let you go easily. He shouldn't. He shouldn't. Second, assume that we have been tainted already, and be honest about how and where. You know, what I don't want you to do is leave the sanctuary this morning thinking, well, that's true, Paul. There's probably some worldly Christians out there. I'm glad I'm not one of them. Oh. You know the argument about the frog in the kettle, you know, that you can evidently, and I have not tried this, by the way. Evidently, you can put a frog in a pot and turn on the heat slowly, and the frog will boil before he'll ever jump out, because he never feels the changes, the gradation in temperature change. That's what they say. I'm not encouraging you to try this experiment. It seems cruel to me. It is cruel, but anyway, so don't try it at home. No need to do it. Somebody did it once and wrote about it. We all know it. All right, the frog in the kettle, that's the way we are. We often, the changes in the world are often so subtle, but over time you look back and you're like, my goodness, this place isn't the same as it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. Then you recognize it. But we all sort of give in a little bit more every time something new takes place, every time the world gets a little further away from our values, we just kind of concede it. And eventually, we're living in a world that doesn't look anything like it did 20, 30, 40 years ago, and we've kind of accepted it. And sometimes we've embraced it, and that's when it gets dangerous. A recent poll from the Barna Group, now they study sort of sociological trends among Christians and the culture, highlighted what's been called our new moral code. Here are the percentages of those who agreed completely or somewhat with the following statements. Here's the statement. The best way to find yourself is to look within. And I can't really relate to that. That's a little bit, I'm kind of a left brain guy. I don't know what that even means, but you know, the best way to find yourself is to look within. Certainly doesn't seem to be a biblical worldview. 91% of adults agreed, 76% of practicing Christians agreed. Well, you say, well, I don't really know what that one meant, so let's go on. People should not criticize someone else's lifestyle choices. Now, that's a little more interesting. 89% agreed in our world of tolerance, of course. 76% of Christians agreed. Now you could say, well, those Christians are probably just trying not to be sort of brutally judgmental to others, so maybe we'll give them a pass on that. Here's a good one. To be fulfilled in life, you should pursue the things you desire most. Okay, that doesn't sound like Jesus, does it? To be fulfilled in life, pursue the things you desire most. 86% of people agreed. 72% of Christians agreed. I'm wondering where they went to Sunday school. The highest goal in life is to enjoy it as much as possible. Okay, now that one's obvious, right? You know, Christians should be disagreeing with that one right and left. The highest goal in life is enjoy it. Get everything you can out of it. 84% of adults agreed. 66% of Christians agreed. People can believe whatever they want. All right, here's a good one. People can believe whatever they want as long as those beliefs don't affect society. 79% of adults agreed. 61% of Christians agreed. Any kind of sexual expression between two consenting adults is acceptable. Here's where the rubber meets the road. Anything people do sexually is okay as long as there's consent. 69% of the world agreed. 40% of Christians agreed. I want to know where those 40% of Christians go to church. And how they've been so affected by the culture that they're saying there is no sexual norm in the world. And without getting into this too deeply, do you know what the Bible, what sexuality is intended to express? Paul talks about this in Ephesians. The sexual expression in the human family between a man and a woman is the picture of Christ's love for the church. That's what human sexuality on earth is intended to express theologically. The intimacy between a man and a woman is intended to express the intimacy and love between Christ and the church that he died for. Which means any deviation from that, and I'm not talking just about homosexuality, I'm talking about premarital sex, all of it. Infidelity, all of it. When we deviate from God's norm, we're not using sex the way it was intended to be. And 40% of Christians said that just doesn't matter. Based on these results, David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons conclude the morality of self-fulfillment is everywhere, like the air we breathe. Much of the time, we don't even notice we're constantly bombarded with messages that reinforce self-fulfillment in music and movies and video games and apps and commercials and TV shows and every other kind of media. Sadly, the church in the Western world is doing everything it can to be relevant, and that's not bad, but in order to be relevant at times, we're willing to compromise, and that is bad. The danger alert should go up then. We're embarrassed by the Bible. Let's be honest. We're embarrassed by what God has said at times because of how it doesn't fit in to the world anymore. So we stop defending its true message. And that has not made us stronger. Third, don't let the world set your standard for morality, meaning, and blessing in life. Now, it's like saying don't let water get you wet. I get it. All right, but that's the goal, is to not let the world press us into its mold, as the Apostle Paul says. We are bombarded at the values level through the media, through education, through advertising, etc. There's a study here, a steady diet of romantic sitcom movies. My favorite movies. No. Thank you for not believing that. A steady diet of romantic sitcom. I'm good with them if Rambo's in them. That's great then. A steady diet of romantic sitcom movies sets us up to be disappointed with the imperfect love of spouses or families. That's the conclusion lead researcher Kimberly Johnson came to after exploring the influence romantic comedies have on us. Johnson and her researchers at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, Scotland, sought to determine if romantic comedies influence how we view love, sex, and marriage. They examined 40 box office hits between 1995 and 2005, such as Runaway Bride, Notting Hill. I know I've watched Notting Hill, forgive me. Runaway Bride, Notting Hill, You've Got Mail, Made in Manhattan. I've seen that one too. I actually liked it. Oh my, pray for me. You know that, right? You know that movie? You know, the politician falls in love with it's really a good movie, actually. Made in Manhattan and While You Were Sleeping. Her conclusion was that watching these films harmed love lives by creating wildly unrealistic expectations. I try to keep my wife away from all those movies and books because I want her to think I'm normal. That's not true. Anyway, what they're saying is this. The culture is setting a standard for romance and love that isn't necessarily realistic or Christian, but it makes us feel like we're all missing out on something. We are conditioned by our world. Its packaging has warped our values. There was a study done by the Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine, and they took preschoolers, and they gave them like McDonald's products, okay, which, you know, it's not going to kill you for a preschooler. It's going to kill me, but not going to kill a preschooler. They give them McDonald's products, you know, a hamburger, French fries, things like that. And they gave some of them in McDonald's packaging and some of them in plain wrappers. And they asked the kids which tasted better. What do you think? overwhelmingly, when they had, McDonald's wrappers, the kids said, these are better. God bless McDonald's. They have figured out how to get people to think, that's just amazing to me that the packaging influenced that for preschoolers. They like the branded food. The world has been doing this forever. It's shaping our views. It's branding values, and we fall into it. It's branding values about morality. Is anything wrong anymore? Not according to the world. It's branding views about sexuality, about religion. Is there any truth? Can there really be just one way to heaven? Well, of course not. That seems philosophically ridiculous. Not what Jesus said there's one way to heaven. But the world doesn't. It's branding what we view in geology, astronomy, and cosmology. Is God really in all of this? There's always an alternate explanation to explain away God in all of the major sciences. It's branding our values. It's branding relationships. If you're not happy, just leave. You deserve it. At every turn, we hear self-fulfillment without moral guidelines. It's the fertile valley that Lot chose and Abraham wanted nothing to do with. Lot couldn't resist it. But that fertile valley, I like it. You like it. It's not, even though some of it's bad, it's appealing. How are we doing? How are you doing? Have you chosen Jesus? And you're still really entrenched in the world, or have you chosen Jesus recognizing there's a values reshift and adjustment in my life that I need to make no matter what it costs me? I'm not going to be obnoxious about it or belligerent, but I'm going to be like Jesus no matter what. And people are going to know it because that's who I follow. Understand why God is concerned about the world around us. He's a jealous God. Assume we've been tainted already. Be honest about how and where. And don't let the world set your standards of morality, meaning, and blessing in life.
Thanks for listening to this sermon. We hope you found it connected you to the God of truth and love, who we worship and serve at Bethany Chapel. If you have any questions or want to connect to any of our pastors, please go to our Bethany Chapel app and choose Connect, or go online to bethanychapel.com and click Come. Thanks again, and God bless you.